Hello everyone. In this video, I'll cover the Python version 2 programming models for Azure Functions and explain its features in details while comparing it with Python version 1 programming model. And later, step by step, I'll deploy Python version 2 programming code in the Azure function using the VSCode. So let's start with the explanation of Python version 2 programming model. Microsoft has introduced newer version of the Python programming model, which is version 2, which has a lot of improvements over the original version 1. And this newer model has streamlined the experience for the Python developers. So let's discuss all the improvements one by one. So the first one is simplified folder structure. In the previous version, every time you're defining a new function, you have to create a folder and that define the init.py file as well as functions.json. But in this case, everything is in functions.py file. I'll show this in a couple of minutes. So now the management of classes, functions, and the methods is simplified. Another improvement is the decorator based approach, where all the triggers and binding are now defined as a decorator, where the function can be added as an argument. However, in the previous version, you have to define the function as well as the binding separately. Now the third improvement is the blueprint for organization. If you want to create multiple functions and want to structure them properly, then you can define all those classes, methods, as well as the functions in the blueprints, and that blueprint can be registered into the main function. So you don't need to change your main function and add additional functions over it. And the last one is it has enhanced documentation and it supports IntelliSense in your IDE, which means so when you're writing the function code in the VS Code, it'll be much easier as it will provide the IntelliSense recommendation. So let's check each one of them in detail. So this is the folder structure for Python programming model v1, where there is init.py file where you define the task of the function or introduce your function, where in function.json you have to define the properties and the bindings. So if you want to create multiple functions, then every time you have to create different folder for that function. And in that folder, you have to define init.py file and function.json, which is a replication of efforts. In the host.json file, you define the different values like application insight, logging for the remote configuration, which is Azure in this case. Local settings.json file contains all the configuration which makes this function to run locally. And the requirements.txt list all the different packages which needs to be installed before running or packaging this function. So in case you want to integrate the Azure Functions with SQL, then the SQL package needs to be installed, which will be defined in the requirements.txt. Now the difference in the V2 model is that multiple folder structure is gone and you can define everything in the functions app.py. You can define multiple functions here. Host.json, local settings.json, requirements.txt is everything same. venv is the virtual environment which is created before running the Python function locally. So this is same in both the versions. However, there is one more file which can be created here, which is blueprint, which I'll show in a couple of slides. Now comes to triggers and bindings. So in Python version 1, there is init.py file and functions.json file. So every time you define a function, you need to create these two files in a separate folder. So here you can see the function is defined. All the task and response of the function are defined here. However, the bindings, which type of function this is, what are the methods used, everything has to be defined in functions.json, which is not very Pythonic. However, in the version 2, this has been taken care. Now, as a decorator, you can define the function and use the function as an argument itself. So here it's an HTTP trigger, which means the function will trigger with an HTTP request. So here the function request and response are defined, and then the function is called in the same file using the argument. So using the decorator, you can easily define multiple functions within the same file itself. Now there are multiple triggers in the V2 version of the Python. HTTP trigger, where the function is invoked using an HTTP request. Timer trigger runs the function on a specified schedule like a cron or a scheduler. In the blob trigger, it responds to the events in the blob storage. That means if you have created a new blob file, automatically this function will be triggered. Now there are queue trigger, which is based on Azure Storage Queue, event grid trigger, which is based on Azure Event Grid, service bus trigger, and Cosmos TV trigger. So now Python version 2 function can be created using all these triggers. But in this video, I'll focus only on the HTTP trigger, and I'll create separate videos for different triggers. The next improvement is the blueprints. So for the logical grouping of the functions, different classes, methods, you can define in a separate file with the name blueprint.py. So there you define the function. Here it's showing a HTTP trigger where it returns the hello from blueprint. It's a very basic sample function. Defining the function in the blueprint file, you have to register the same function into the main functions app.py file. And then automatically this function along with the main function will be called. And if there are multiple functions, all those functions will be deployed into the Azure Functions app. And the last one is the IntelliSense in the IDE, which I'll show you in the lab itself. So now before starting the deployment in the lab, let me show you the deployment step we are going to follow. So first we'll install the Python version 3.12. Though there is 3.13 version which is also available, but it's not supported yet. So Python 3.12 version will be installed first on the operating system. Then for Azure Function, core tools have to be installed. This will also be installed in the operating system, or through the VSCode you can do it. And we'll be using the VSCode for all these deployment. To make the VSCode work, we need to add different extensions like Azure Functions and the Python extension, using which VSCode so help us create the Python version 2 code and then deploy into Azure Functions. After that, we'll sign into Azure account through the VSCode, then create the Python version 2 function locally. Afterwards, through the VSCode itself, we'll create the Azure function, which will be in the Azure. So, and later the Python code which is created here locally will be deployed into the Azure function. And finally, we'll test the Python function locally as well as in the Azure Functions app. Now I'll go to the lab and show all these steps practically. I'm logged into Azure portal now. And let's quickly check if we have any function app already deployed. So there are no function apps. So based on the deployment step, I'll first install the Python in my operating system. Let's go to python.org downloads. Latest version is 3.12. However, that is not supported. So let's download 3.11. 3.11.9 download. Windows installer 64-bit. And I'll install this quickly. Install now. This installation process should take a minute or so. Python is installed now. Now let's open the Visual Studio. Now let's open the folder where I would like to save my code. So open folder. So the folder name is function Python. So before we start anything, let's install two extensions. Go to the extensions. First, the Python extension. Install. Python extension is installed now, and it is installed the Python debugger too along with it. So now let's look for Azure Functions. Let's install Azure Function. And Azure Function is also installed now. Let's go back to our editor. Now what you have to do is press F1 and Azure Functions core tools. So this will install or update the core tools. Or there is another option. What you can do is you can go to this website, develop Azure Functions locally using the core tools, click on Python and download it from here and then install it. So, but in this case, I'll use the VS Code. I'm in the VS Code now. Press F1. Azure Functions, Core Tools. Install and update the Azure Functions Core Tools. Azure Function version 4. And you can see it's running the npm install command for the core tools. And this core tool packages will be installed soon. And the usage of the core tool is so that you can package the Python function locally and run them in your IDE. Core tools are installed now, as you can see. It changed 35 packages and audited 36 packages. And it's finished running the command npm install core tools. Now the next step is to log into Azure. Click on Azure. Because I've already signed in, so it's showing me my subscription. Click on this subscription and it's showing me all the details. However, in your case, when you will click here, you may need to sign in and provide your username and credential. Then all the details of your Azure resources will be published here. Now let's start with the creation of Azure Function app. Function F1, Azure Functions, and create function app in Azure. There are two options. One is the normal one, another one is advanced. So let's go with advanced, where we'll get more options. Now we have to provide a globally unique name. Demo Shalender function Python. I think this should be enough. Now to run a function app, we need a different service plan. It can be consumption, flexible, premium, or app service plan. So in this case, I'll use the consumption plan. So that means my billing charges will incur only when the function app will be running. Consumption. I'm in Australia, so I'll select Australia East. And the Python version is 3.11, which we have installed too. Let's create a new resource group. Because our ID is integrated with Azure, so we can create all the resources from here. Let's create a new resource group. Let's give this resource group name as function Python. And for the function app to run, we need to create a storage account too. Let's create a new storage account. So let's name it a st demo Shalender function Python. So let's create the application insight resource also, which will do the monitoring and logging. Name of the new application insight resource will be the same. And as you can see here, it's creating the function app. First, it's creating the storage account in Australia East with standard LRS. And then the function app will be created. It will take few minutes to create all the resources. So right now it's on 6 by 6, which means it's on the 6th step, and it's just installing the function app. So let's go back to Azure portal and look for storage account. And our Python function storage account is created. And the resources and the resource group name is RG function Python. It has the app service plan, where we are using the consumption plan, application insight, and the storage account. Soon there should be function app too. And the function app is also created, as you can see. So here the function app is created, but there are no functions right now. As you can see in the functions, it's asking us to create a function, but right now there are no functions. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And if you look in the output section, you can see all the steps which are performed. First, it created the resource group. Then app service plan was created. Application insight, storage account, and finally the function app. Let's create the function now. Function F1 and Azure Functions create function. And this is the location of the function where we are right now. It's a Python function, the model v2 we are going to create. So the version which we have installed is 3.11.9. And here we'll be using the HTTP trigger. There are multiple triggers which I have already explained, but in this video, I'll be focusing only on the HTTP trigger, which means the function will trigger through the HTTP request only. And let's name it as sample underscore HTTP trigger underscore 1. We are not setting it up as anonymous. It should be through the function. Now it's creating a virtual environment. So it's initiating the get, creating the virtual environment, venv, so that when we package this function and run it locally, it should run in the virtual environment only, and all the dependencies should not clash with the other projects in our environment. So the function in the Python is created now. It's a preview page where you can understand about the function which we have just created. Let's close this. So let's go one by one. So this is the virtual environment. So whenever you run it locally, you go into virtual environment, scripts, and activate it using the PS1 PowerShell script. So this creates a virtual environment for Azure Functions so that when you package the function and run it locally, it should not clash with any other packages which are available. Then the VS Code, where it has detail because this function is created in the VS Code. Function ignore, this will ignore all these directories or the files. If you are going to push this code, so the files which should be ignored are mentioned here. Now the main file, which is functions app.py, where it's ignoring the Azure function as a function, and import the logging. Now the function in the form of HTTP trigger, where we have defined the name, is defined here. If we'll not provide any name, then it will provide this message that HTTP trigger function executed successfully. Pass a name in the query string or in the request body. And if we provide the name, then hello, the name as well as this message will be shown. This defined function is provided as an argument here, which is a decorator, and this is an improvement in the version 2 from the version 1, because in version 1 we used to define all the functions separately in different folders using the init.py as well as functions.json file. But here, like you have defined one function, you can define multiple functions here. Now the next file is host.json. It shows the application inside details. The logging is enabled in the application inside, it's enabled. And so what is the extension which we are using? The Azure Function extension. Because this function app can be deployed in these local settings are defined here so that we can run the Python function locally. And the last one is the requirements, where all the dependency net packages are listed. So in case you want to integrate with SQL or the Azure Key Vault, all those packages need to be provided here. Because if you want to run it locally or if you want to deploy it, first Python installer will install all the packages which are provided in the requirement.txt. Now the function is ready and we understand how it's going to work. So let's deploy this into Azure Function app. Go to the Azure extension. It's Azure Function extension. So this is our local project. Deploy to Azure. And it will show which Azure function. You can create the function app from here, but because we have already created the function app in the previous step, so let's deploy it to the existing one. Demo Shalendar function Python. Let's select that one. And it's loading all the configuration there. And it's ready. And it's asking, should we deploy it now? Click on deploy. And it's deploying the function to function app. First it's packaging it, then it's deploying. As you can see in the output section, the source directory is where it's extracted and the destination directory. And it's done. Let's go to our function app now. Refresh. And now you can see there is a sample HTTP trigger one. This function app is created. Because we have deployed this function using the VS Code, so we can't make the changes here. So the editing in the portal is disabled. Let's test this function. Go to the Visual Studio Code and go to our folder. Now there are two options. We can run it through the command line, or there's an option, easy one, run without debugging. So there are three commands which will be run in the background too. First one will be install all the dependencies present in requirements.txt, then activate the virtual environment, and finally start the function. So run without debugging, you can see all this here. So pip install requirement.txt, whatever is present here will be installed. Then it's activating the virtual environment and the function host will start. And in this case, it has started. As you can see, this is localhost 7071. So it's hosted locally. Now go to this link, press Ctrl and use the left click of the mouse and it should open in the browser. And this is the response which we are getting now. The HTTP triggered function executed successfully. If we'll go to our code, functions app.py, if we don't pass the name, this is what we should be getting. Now let's provide the name and see if the response changes. Go back to the URL, use the question mark, name is equal to Shailendra, enter, and here you go. Hello Shailendra, this HTTP function triggered successfully. That's perfect. Now we have hosted this locally, but we have already deployed this into the Azure Function app. So how do we run through Azure Function app? So there are two ways. First, let's go to Visual Studio Code. Go to the Azure extension. Open all the resources. Go to the function app. It should be visible here. And in the function app, the function should also be visible here. So this is the function. Click on the function. Copy function URL. This is one way. Another one is you go to the portal, go to the function app, go to your function and get function URL. You can copy the function key. Open a tab and run this. And here you go. Because we didn't provide the name and we got this response. Let's provide the name now. And in this case, provide the end name is equal to Shailendra. And we got a hello Shailendra response. So that means our function app is running fine. And the function which we defined in the code is working both locally as well as in remote. Now, one last thing I would like to show you is the blueprints. So let's go to the Visual Studio Code and go to our code. So instead of defining another function here, let's create a blueprint file and define another HTTP trigger function. You can write the code. However, in this case, I'll use the VS Code. Press F1, Azure Function, create function. So again, we are using the HTTP trigger. So now there are multiple options. Add the HTTP trigger function to an existing file, create a new blueprint file, or event hub trigger. So we will be creating a new blueprint file. So the blueprint file name will be blueprint.py. Enter. So let's change it to blueprint underscore trigger underscore 2. Same way, we'll use the function. And if we'll go in the blueprint.py file, you can see that file is created where the function is defined. And the same way, after defining the function, and it's exactly the same HTTP trigger function, if you'll provide the name, then you will get this response, otherwise the standard response. And this function is used in an argument here. And you can define in the same file itself. But this is a blueprint file. So you have to now register this function into the function app.py file. And here are the steps. First import and then register. So let's go to function app. Now import the blueprint file from blueprint, import blueprint. And then we have to register the function which we have created in the blueprint file. We can copy directly from here because we haven't changed anything and we are using the standard one. And let's run this locally. Now there should be two functions created. First, it will take care of the prerequisites and then run the function. So as you can see, two functions are triggered. One is for the sample trigger one, which we have already tested. This one is the blueprint one. And let's test this one. Click and open here. And it is providing the response which we are looking for. And let's provide the name. I'll provide my last name this time. And we got what we wanted. Perfect. So both the functions are working now. So let's deploy it to Azure. Go to the Azure extension. And in the workspace, click on deploy to Azure. Same function app. So it's packaging it and deploying it into the Azure Function app. It's deployed successfully now. Let's go to Azure Functions. Let's go to Azure Function app. And there should be two functions now. Perfect. Let's click on the second one because first one we have already tried. Get function URL. Copy the function key. Open it here. And this is what we were looking for. Now let's provide the name. And perfect. It's providing the correct response. To summarize this video, first I explained all the improvements in the version 2 over the ordinary version, which was version 1. Then I explained the concepts and compared it with the version 1. And in the lab, I have deployed Python v2 programming code first and then deployed it to the Azure function where we tested it locally as well as in the Azure Functions app. And in both the cases, it was working fine. And finally, we tried the blueprint feature also where we can add more functions, and that too also worked successfully. I hope you liked this video. Please like and subscribe. Thank you so much.